If we had more federalism across a range of issues, I think we'd be less politically polarized because there would be 50 levels of government making decisions about tough issues rather than one that feels do or die existential. We got to win this election or get this bill passed through Congress. And also just opening it up to innovation where if you have 50 states that are, I would say, constitutionally designed to be laboratories of innovation, to be policy leaders, we could have a lot more creativity around solving tough issues. So I give all that. I'm very cognizant of the skeptics or the folks who are concerned about this. And when it comes to the social welfare system, we've been talking about the food stamp program. There are kind of two, I guess, critiques or questions that I'm sure some skeptics out there could have that I'd love to hear you respond to. And it might be this, that a skeptic or a critic of the idea of safety net federalism might point to the high error rates in some states when it comes to food stamps as evidence of, well, no, states sometimes don't do a great job running these, so we shouldn't push more authority or innovation to the state level. Or even some of the news coverage a little while back about, I believe it was the state of Minnesota with high fraud rates and things like that. So if someone's watching this in the news or hearing these kinds of things and thinking, well, wait, why would we want to push more to the states when there are some problems? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the reason you see this kind of sloppiness in the states is precisely the opposite. It's because the states really didn't have to foot the bill. They didn't want trouble from the feds when they got pressure under Obama and definitely under Biden to look the other way and not confirm eligibility. They didn't want trouble. They don't want to have Department of Justice lawyers showing up and investigating them. And on top of it, what do they care if some extra checks go out? More money gets spent in their state. So it was the opposite. They had no incentive because they were not footing the bill. In some ways, it's sort of the mirror of the program itself. When you perpetuate this generational dependency, why should I look for a job? Somebody else is going to feed me. Somebody else has got to provide me housing. And you kind of take away the dignity. So I think that federalism would indicate, and that's the attempt here with this OB3. It's small, but it's important. It's an attempt to get the people who have to administer the program to foot the bill so they have an incentive to do it properly. And so then the broader question with federalism is, do we really need to collect money from every working person and business in this country and send it to Washington, D.C. for Washington, D.C. to take a cut and attach rules to it, and then send it right back to the states to feed the hungry? Is that really the best way to feed the hungry in this country? Because it seems like the opposite of the best way. I mean, the way many of us were brought up, if you see someone hungry, you feed them. And that's generally how we took care of people for the longest time. In many communities, we still do. I'm sure your church, my church, we have a pantry. We give alms. We give money to help the poor. We support a kitchen. Like, that's where it should begin, instead of trying to get Washington to do it. That's just insanity, it seems to me, because then you're involved in people's lives when you're doing it in community.
Tony, there's something that comes to mind as you're talking, and it's actually making me reflect on the way I talk about this issue. I very recently was in Washington, D.C. for the Alliance for Opportunity Meant for More Summit. Fantastic event, and had some other convenings while I was out there with American Enterprise Institute, for example, and just a lot of great groups and people on the national level working on these issues to try and improve our social welfare system and having these conversations about how do we have states have more of a leadership role. And I've spoken at a number of these events, and I think I've often used the language of, well, we need more state flexibility as sort of a shorthand. But this conversation is making me kind of rethink the framing to say that instead of just saying, well, we need just more federalism, more state flexibility, so don't frame it as we just need to let states kind of do whatever they want and let the chips fall where they may, because that leads to the concerns of folks like, well, some states are not going to administer these things well. And so should we reframe this to say we want accountable federalism? And maybe that's adding a modifier. You all have the Center for Practical Federalism, but is a different way to think about it that, yes, we want federalism, but we need transparency, we need accountability, and maybe instead of just saying flexibility, we need to empower states to be innovators, which flexibility means just maybe loosening the rules, but innovation means empowering states to think creatively in pursuit of a better objective. Are these the kinds of ways maybe we should be talking about this?
Right. I think if you take the Minnesota example, or any state that administers a program poorly and allows corruption, the bet with federalism is if the taxpayers of the state actually have to foot the bill, there's more of a penalty. But with this program, it's all we taxpayers who foot the bill for one state's corruption or incompetence. And so federalism is the first step to get more accountability. And then, of course, many of us believe ideally you'd push the authority even further down in communities, because it's just the closer you live to the people making the decision, the easier they are to hold accountable. But that as long as the bill is paid by some bureaucracy in Washington, it's almost a point of pride for some states and politicians to milk as much as they can out of the program and not worry at all about how it gets spent, which is the opposite of good governance.
Tony, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and obviously these are really deep issues that we can spend hours and hours and hours on. I think many state leaders in the coming years will be doing that as they're looking at how to implement all this stuff. But maybe one also broad question, because as I think about the opportunity to push for more responsible federalism, accountable, practical federalism in the right way that you're kind of articulating in this report from Alliance for Opportunity that, again, we'll link to in the show notes, in the way that this outlines it, one of the big questions on my mind is where are we missing the intellectual framework or the arguments for this kind of brand of responsible, innovative, safety net federalism? Where do we miss some intellectual support for making that case? What can state level policy voices do to fill that gap? How do we essentially make this a cohesive message that is evidence-based and really is compelling that this is the right direction for our country?
Yeah, it's we've created some perverse incentives where we've asked Washington D.C. to do things that are not in its enumerated powers and to take that burden off of states, direct burden off of states. Well, of course, we in the states are still paying the bill, but our state government, isn't taxing us. And somehow that's supposed to be a triumph. And so I think the honest answer, Nick, is, and you see this in Utah, I mean, maybe more than any other state, we have to demand that our state leaders, both at the state level and the ones we send to Washington to represent us, we've got to demand that they are the voice for federalism, that they are going to Washington and saying, you know what, no more of this. We want our federal taxes lower, and we, the states, will take on these responsibilities again. And that means having the courage in the states to generate the revenue to do that. But I think that's the courageous decision that has to happen, because as long as we allow state leaders to foist all these responsibilities off to DC so they can keep our taxes seemingly low, right? The federal government will eat us out of house and home and drive us into, national unrecoverable debt along the way. So we've got to demand from our representatives that they are defending federalism, both here and in DC.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.